When giants of the wild shatter our sense of safety, chaos erupts in seconds. From grizzlies storming mountain resorts to Kodiaks charging through glacier fog, calm turns deadly in an instant. Rivers flip under roaring bears, trails turn selfies into nightmares, and ice lakes become battlegrounds for hungry predators. In this video, we'll dive into 6 chilling tales of bear attacks on humans, blending instinct, fear, and survival. Watch till the end. On December 2nd, 2025, a quiet mountain resort in Wyoming welcomed winter travelers with soft lights, warm rooms, and snow-covered paths. Among the guests arriving that week were Mark Lawson, his wife Emily, and their 2 children, Jake and Sophie. The family enjoyed winter trips, and Mark had planned this visit early so the children could experience calm slopes before the holiday rush. His long work hours at home made these breaks meaningful, allowing him to focus entirely on family time. Emily appreciated peaceful mountain surroundings and kept small snacks ready for the children. Jake looked forward to open hills, while Sophie preferred warm corners and steady comfort. They seemed prepared for a simple, relaxing winter stay. Winter storms had arrived early, pushing wildlife down from higher ridges. Staff had tried to manage outdoor waste carefully, yet drifting ice, long nights, and deep cold made the surrounding forest a place where hungry animals moved freely. That morning appeared uneventful as guests rolled suitcases inside, brushed off snow, and formed lines at the check-in desk. Mark and Emily stood near the counter, helping Jake and Sophie remove gloves, when a large grizzly wandered close to the buildings. The heavy cold and empty slopes had driven it lower in search of food. Scents from open bags and treats in the lobby cafe drifted outward. Drawn by this mixture, the bear moved toward a side entrance left partially open during a luggage transfer. Without warning, the animal rushed into the lobby. A heavy thump echoed across the tile as its weight struck the door frame. The door pushed inward, and the bear burst inside, causing several guests to stumble. Tables scraped across the floor as people slipped on melted ice. Chairs toppled, and holiday decorations trembled under the sudden force. The bear knocked over a luggage cart, scattering coats and bags. A decorative sled near the cafe counter slid across the room after a sharp blow from its paw, striking a wall and leaving a crack in the plaster. Another swing shattered a low table, sending pieces across the tiles. Nearby, a display of wood shavings around an indoor fire feature scattered across the floor. A spark from the heater ignited the loose pieces, flaring briefly before dying down. Emily moved the children behind a heavy desk, while Mark grabbed a fire extinguisher from a corner. Guests tried to back away, but the wet floor caused many to slip. The bear circled the lobby, striking bags, pushing carts, and crashing into furniture with powerful, confused movements. Snow blew through the torn doorway, mixing with smoke from the scattered shavings. Resort security rushed in from the hallway, using a bright flare to divert the animal. The sudden light captured the bear's attention. After a tense moment, the grizzly turned and retreated toward the snowy forest, leaving behind a lobby filled with broken furniture and shaken families. Silence settled over the room as the animal disappeared into the trees. Cold air swept through the damaged entrance, mixing with drifting flakes and faint smoke. Mark lowered the extinguisher, hands trembling as he tried to steady his breathing. Emily kept Jake and Sophie close, shielding them from small pieces of debris dropping from the damaged doorway frame. Guests gradually stood, brushing off melted snow and dust as they tried to grasp what had happened. Security staff approached carefully, checking corners and guiding people away from unstable furniture. The flare burned faintly near the entrance, casting a pale glow over the wrecked space. The fire feature no longer produced heat, and the scattered shavings smoldered only in weak embers. Water from broken drink containers formed shallow pools across the tile, mixing with splintered wood and crushed decorations. Emily helped the children stand while Mark guided them down a safer hallway. Workers placed temporary barriers across the broken entrance to prevent more snow from drifting in. The once welcoming area now resembled a winter wreck, marked by deep claw streaks across luggage, bent metal poles, and overturned carts. Medical staff arrived with first aid kits, checking for cuts and bruises. Some guests had scraped their hands after slipping, while others had twisted ankles during the frantic attempt to escape. Jake clung silently to Emily, eyes wide, while Sophie held tightly to Mark's arm. Staff wrapped blankets around both children, and encouraged slow breathing to calm their shaking. The resort manager organized a head count to ensure all visitors were accounted for. People gathered near the back corridor, forming a tense but orderly group. Workers passed out warm drinks to settle nerves. Although the incident had ended quickly, the shock lingered heavily. Guests stared at the shattered tables and cracked sled frame, fully aware of how close they had come to danger. Outside, faint tracks marked the bear's retreat, forming deep impressions in the fresh snow. Security teams followed only long enough to confirm the animal had moved far from the buildings. They returned quickly, knowing that pursuing a stressed animal through snowy terrain could create new hazards. The early winter had already pushed wildlife into lower ground, making any structure with food sense a potential target. Repair crews arrived with tools, working through the night to stabilize the entrance and clear debris. Broken lamps, crushed decorations, and twisted metal were removed in carts. Workers mopped melted ice and wiped soot from the floor. The cleanup revealed the bear's strength. Even thick wooden beams carried long gouges from its claws. Mark and Emily settled the children in a quiet room away from the damage. The family sat together, slowly recovering from the lingering fear. Many other guests gathered in nearby lounges, speaking softly about the event, sharing blankets, and avoiding the lobby until repairs progressed. By dawn, the lobby no longer resembled a welcoming entry, but stood as a reminder of how quickly calm can collapse in wild country. Snow drifted gently against the boarded repairs as morning light touched the windows. Although fear had not fully faded, everyone felt grateful that no lives had been lost. The damaged space served as a clear warning that in harsh mountain regions, even strong walls and bright lights cannot always stop the force of a desperate roaming giant. In October 2023, a quiet chill settled over the long bends of the Amur River as Dmitry Petrov guided a small motorboat through the wide, cold water. He was a careful man in his early 40s, the type who moved with steady precision and rarely rushed. Much of his life had been spent working near forests and rivers, and his calm nature made him well-suited for long journeys through remote areas. He often assisted with the early stages of winter preparations, setting up simple shelters for local hunters who relied on solid camps before the first deep freeze. His wife, Olga, sat near the bow of the boat, steady and observant, her posture relaxed but attentive. She had grown up in a nearby village and knew the land deeply, understanding the rhythm of seasons and the signs that marked shifting weather. Both carried practical gear, worn maps, basic tools, and warm layers for the long day. Their goal was straightforward: locate a good, safe place to establish a winter shelter before storms made travel more difficult. The river was quiet but carried a heavy stillness, the kind that hinted at distant storms or unsettled wildlife. Along the winding banks, tall trees pressed close together, their trunks darkened by moisture and their branches shaking gently in the cold wind. Tracks in the soft ground showed evidence of movement, signs of animals traveling along the shore in search of food. But from the low angle of the boat, neither Dmitry nor Olga could see anything clearly. They focused on the bends ahead and the rising banks where shelters had been placed in earlier years, checking for obvious changes in the land or shifting currents that might affect winter use. Not far from their path, a large Russian grizzly moved steadily through shadowed woods. Hunger had pushed it far beyond its usual territory. The previous season had been poor, with almost no fish making their way upriver, and the scarcity had left the animal weakened. Its heavy body carried visible strain, ribs showed faintly beneath thick fur, and its gait was slow yet tense. It moved with instinctive purpose, guided by a sharp nose that caught every trace of scent drifting through the cold air. The smell of food from the couple's small cooler carried across the water, drawing the animal closer to the bank with each step. High above the shore, hidden behind a fallen tree, another figure watched the river. Pavel, a lone hunter scouting conditions for the coming freeze, had paused to study the waterway below. He noticed the small motorboat moving along the bend and wondered quietly where the pair intended to travel. He remained still, unaware that a powerful animal was cutting a path through the dense trees between his lookout point and the water below. As Dmitry and Olga approached a tight turn in the river, the air around them seemed to thicken. The hum of the engine softened as Dmitry reduced speed to study the shoreline more closely. The water darkened beneath the bend, swirling with broken branches drifting in slow circles. At that same moment, the bear reached the edge of the bank, crouched low with its eyes locked on the moving target. The slow current carried the scent of the couple's supplies directly toward its muzzle, sharpening the animal's focus. Before the couple sensed any threat, the massive animal surged forward with startling force. Its paws tore into the soil, sending clumps of earth flying as it launched itself toward the river. The shadows along the tree line split apart as the huge form burst into the open, racing down the steep slope toward the narrow stretch where the boat drifted. The river, once calm and steady, transformed instantly into a trap as the attack began. The bear collided with the side of the motorboat, lifting one edge and sending a spray of cold water across the surface. The violent impact threw Olga into the freezing river, where her body tumbled through the shock of icy current. Gear and loose items spun beside her as the cold struck her lungs, dragging her downward before she fought her way back up, gasping as the current pulled her through swirling foam and broken branches. The collision shoved the boat sideways, pinning Dmitri beneath part of the heavy frame. He pushed desperately at the metal pressing into his chest, his hands slipping on the wet surface. The vessel groaned under the weight as the bear planted its paws on top, its weight pressing downward. Water churned around the twisted hull as the animal shifted, tearing at wooden boards and crushing thin material with each movement. Up on the bank, Pavel saw the destruction unfold. From his vantage point, he could see the dark, immense shape towering above the broken structure. He scrambled down the slope, though the ground was uneven and coated with slick frost that slowed every step. Raising his rifle, he fired a round into the air, hoping the noise would break the animal's focus. The sharp crack rolled across the water, but the bear continued its assault, driven by instinct and hunger rather than fear. Olga fought the relentless current, her arms growing weak from cold. She grasped a floating branch, clinging to it as her strength faded. The river pushed her in steady surges until she reached a shallow area where rocks scraped against her knees. She collapsed forward, shivering violently and unable to stand. Pavel reached the bank just as the bear stepped away from the crushed remains of the boat. The animal left deep tracks in the mud as it moved toward the forest, disappearing between the trees with the same suddenness as its arrival. A torn path of branches and overturned earth marked its retreat. When Pavel reached the broken boat, he found Dmitri trapped beneath the wreckage. He struggled to lift the damaged frame, but the weight was too great, and the injuries already inflicted were irreversible. The river around him was quiet except for the low rush of current. Olga lay nearby, trembling and nearly unresponsive, her strength exhausted by the cold. By dawn, help finally reached the remote scene. Both Dmitri and Olga had succumbed to the crushing injuries from the attack and the freezing conditions. The ruined boat drifted gently beside the rocks, a stark sign of the sudden violence that had struck without warning. Pavel stood alone on the bank, shaken by the memory of what he had witnessed and by the reminder that the wild rivers of the region carried dangers far beyond human control. In May 2024, Evan Mallory and Tyler Hansen traveled to a remote stretch of glacier country on Kodiak Island to complete a photography project they had planned for months. Evan had spent years photographing wildlife throughout cold regions, developing a practiced eye for movement across frozen terrain. Tyler, meanwhile, had studied the behavior of ice formations and loved capturing how morning light spread across broad, frost-coated surfaces. Both men had trained carefully for winter travel and carried warm clothing, food supplies, and specialized camera tools packed inside sturdy bags. To protect themselves from the sudden gusts that often swept across the open glacier, they had built light snow shelters near their camp, arranging each wall to shield them from unpredictable winds. After a long trek over hard ridges and frozen stretches, the pair reached the remote ice field. The air felt sharp and clean, and the blue glow beneath their boots shifted with every step, revealing fractures deep below the surface. They left a small pile of fish inside sealed containers beside their shelters, planning to cook it later after finishing the day's work. The landscape appeared silent, with only distant birds circling above the cliffs, their calls faint against the wide emptiness. Neither man noticed the heavy tracks pressed into the snow far from camp, nor the slow, cautious movement of a large animal weaving between uneven ice walls beyond their sight. As the morning grew colder, thin clouds drifted overhead, dimming the light across the glacier. Evan and Tyler walked toward a deep crevasse. hoping to capture detailed images of how cracks formed along its edges and how shadows deepened inside its narrow walls. The ground glittered with a fine layer of frost that made every step slippery. They adjusted their gloves and lowered their faces to block the cutting wind. Peaks rose above them like white towers, and the stillness made each movement echo widely, bouncing sound off the icy ridges in slow, hollow waves. When they reached the edge of the crevasse, they prepared their equipment and studied the patterns of ice forming along the drop. At the same moment, the frozen world around them shifted with sudden force. From behind a sharp ridge of ice, a massive Kodiak bear burst into view, its dark figure rising against the pale background. The animal had followed the faint scent of fish near their shelter and now charged with startling speed across the slick surface. Snow sprayed outward as its paws struck the ground, sending shards of ice spinning in the cold air. Tyler tried to step back, but the brittle surface beneath him split, causing him to slide sideways across the edge. His camera slipped from his grip and dropped into a narrow fissure, disappearing into the darkness below before he could react. Evan rushed toward him, grabbing his jacket and pulling him behind a low snow berm. Their gloves scraped the frozen ground as they tried to stay low and still. The bear reached their gear first, slamming into backpacks and tossing items across the glacier. A tent pole snapped sharply as the animal clawed through the area, shoving heavy bags aside as though they weighed nothing. Cold wind swept loose snow through the chaos, making it difficult to follow the precise path of the animal's movements. Evan held a flare with unsteady hands while Tyler tried to recover his balance. The bear circled near the berm, leaving deep, widening marks across the glacier as the two men braced for whatever came next. The ice beneath them trembled slightly each time the animal shifted its weight. The air carried a sharp, metallic chill that blended with the smell of disturbed snow and cracked ice. The animal moved closer, pressing its weight against the icy surface as it searched for anything holding a strong scent. Evan kept the flare ready, while Tyler steadied his breath behind the low rise of frozen ground. The wind hissed across the glacier, pushing loose flakes around their legs and filling the air with a grainy mist. For a brief moment, the bear paused, lifting its head as if listening for sound or movement. Evan struck the flare, sending a burst of bright light across the dim space. The sudden flash cut sharply through the cold air and made the bear step back. Sparks drifted in small arcs, sizzling softly where they landed on the ice. The animal turned sharply, shaking its head, and began to move away from the berm. As it withdrew, it crushed scattered gear beneath its weight, breaking straps, flattening bags, and leaving deep indentations in the snow-packed surface. The men remained crouched until the last trace of movement disappeared behind a tall block of ice. When the heavy shape finally vanished into the distance, Evan helped Tyler stand. Tyler winced as cold pain shot through his legs from the fall, and his clothing was soaked through with melted frost. The two gathered what few pieces of equipment remained on the surface. Most of their items were damaged or buried under crushed snow. Their shelter poles were bent, and several essential supplies had been thrown far from their original place. As daylight sank behind the high peaks, the temperature dropped with alarming speed. The wind sharpened, cutting through their layers and making it difficult to keep steady steps. They knew they had to retreat from the glacier before darkness closed in completely. Evan supported Tyler as they moved across the uneven ice fields, each step slow and deliberate. The ground shifted in places, forcing them to choose safer routes between ridges and fragile crusts. By the time they reached lower ground, their limbs felt heavy from cold and exhaustion. They found a small area sheltered by rocks, where they rested briefly and warmed their hands. The shock of the attack settled in as they looked back toward the distant glacier. The wide ice field that had seemed peaceful earlier in the day now appeared harsh, unpredictable, and filled with hidden risks. Both men carried deep bruises, torn layers of clothing, and lingering tremors from the experience. Their expedition ended without further progress, leaving them more aware of how quickly conditions could change. The memory of the charging bear, the shattered camp, and the fragile surface beneath their feet stayed with them as they prepared to leave the region, grateful to be alive, yet deeply affected by the wild force they had encountered. In June 2021, during the warm Carpathian summer, Laura Weber and her brother Jonas walked along a quiet mountain trail far from busy towns. Laura enjoyed taking long hikes during her vacations, carrying a small backpack filled with snacks, a folded map, and a bottle of water. She appreciated nature and often paused to look closely at trees, wildflowers, or any small creature that moved across the path. Jonas, more cautious by nature, focused on safety. He kept a sturdy walking stick in hand and checked the trail edges regularly to ensure they remained on the correct route. The two siblings spent many summers exploring different landscapes across Europe, favoring places filled with deep forests and clear running streams. On this trip, they planned to reach a well-known waterfall hidden deep in the mountain range. The walk was peaceful, with birds calling from tall pines and a soft wind passing through the leaves. As they moved farther into the hills, the trail narrowed, but both felt relaxed and content. Bright sunlight warmed the open areas, and small pools formed beneath moss-covered rocks near the waterfall. They were accustomed to meeting other hikers on popular routes, yet this particular trail felt quieter than most, giving the area a calm and secluded atmosphere. When they finally arrived at the waterfall, Laura paused to admire the rising mist and the shine of water plunging into the shallow basin below. She loved taking photos during her travels and saw this moment as a perfect scene to capture. As she moved across the flat ground near the splash zone, she turned and noticed a large brown bear standing at a distance. It stood near a patch of shrubs, its powerful body partly concealed by branches. The sight surprised her, but curiosity pushed her to raise her camera, hoping to photograph the scene before the animal moved. As she leaned back slightly to frame the image, the edge of her backpack brushed against a fallen log. The sudden movement startled the bear. The quiet atmosphere shifted instantly as the animal lifted its head, focusing its attention on the siblings. Jonas sensed the change even before he saw the bear begin to move. The enormous creature lowered its body and rushed forward with startling speed, sending loose stones skidding across the ground as its paws struck the trail. Laura had only a moment to react before the bear reached the open area. It charged toward them, scattering hikers who had been lingering near the water and sending stray backpacks rolling across the rocks. The soil trembled under the animal's weight as it swiped at nearby objects. Jonas tried to pull Laura away, but the force of the bear's lunge knocked her to the ground. Sharp claws tore through the sleeve of her jacket, leaving deep scratches along her arms. The bear circled the clearing, growling and pushing scattered items aside, turning what had been a quiet afternoon into a sudden emergency. The chaos spread quickly as hikers searched for cover, unsure how long the danger would last. The tension in the clearing grew heavier as people scrambled towards safer areas along the trail. Jonas remained close to Laura, helping her stand while keeping his eyes fixed on the bear's movements. The animal continued pacing through the debris, kicking water bottles, jackets, and small packs toward the edges of the clearing. Its low, rolling sound echoed against the stone walls of the ravine, warning everyone to keep their distance. Jonas guided Laura toward a cluster of tall bushes, hoping the dense foliage would give them a small barrier of protection. Laura felt sharp pain spreading down both arms, and warm blood slid along her scratched skin. Her legs shook, making each step slow and uncertain. The shock of the attack left her disoriented, and she pressed a hand against her side to stay balanced. Jonas kept a steadying hand on her shoulder and remained alert to every shift in the bear's posture, knowing that turning away completely could place them in even greater danger. The bear paused near a pile of fallen branches and pushed them aside with a heavy paw. It looked toward the forest, then back at the clearing, uncertain whether to advance again or retreat. Other hikers hid behind tree trunks or crouched beside moss-coated stones, watching its movements with fear tightening their expressions. The air felt heavy and still as the large animal continued assessing the space, searching for anything that might pose a threat. The narrow trail behind them shook slightly as a ranger approached from below, carrying bright emergency gear and moving with firm, deliberate steps. He held a burning flare high, its intense light cutting sharply through the shaded clearing. The bright glow disrupted the bear's attention. The animal stepped backward, unsettled by the new movement entering its space. Jonas stayed beside Laura as they slowly edged toward the trees, ready to retreat farther if necessary. The ranger's loud steps and sweeping arm movements created enough disturbance to draw the bear's focus away from the hikers. At last, the brown shape turned toward the thicker vegetation and retreated through the bushes, snapping branches as it moved. The heavy rustling faded until the forest became still once more. Only the sound of the waterfall and the shaky breathing of recovering hikers remained. Jonas helped Laura sit on a smooth rock while others gathered nearby, shaken but relieved that the danger had passed. With the bear gone, hikers spread out to recover scattered belongings. Some retrieved their gear with trembling hands, while others checked the clearing for anyone needing help. Laura sat quietly, exhausted, holding her injured arms close to her chest. Jonas found a clean cloth in his pack and wrapped it around her wounds to slow the bleeding. The ranger surveyed the disturbed ground and overturned items before advising everyone to stay together as they made their way back down the trail. As they began the careful walk away from the waterfall, Laura felt the weight of the event settling into her thoughts. The peaceful outing had shifted into something frightening, revealing how quickly wild places could change from calm to unpredictable. Jonas remained beside her, ensuring she stayed steady as they followed the uneven path toward safety. When they reached the lower trail, additional staff members waited with first aid supplies. They cleaned the injuries on her arms and bandaged the deeper scratches, encouraging her to drink water and breathe slowly. Several hikers rested nearby, still replaying the encounter in their minds. The memory of the rushing bear, the heavy paws striking the ground, and the sudden shift from peace to danger remained vivid for Laura. The quiet hike she had enjoyed only hours earlier now felt distant. As she was guided toward the exit area, she understood how strongly nature could remind people of its power and unpredictability. In March 2019, deep within the frozen Arctic, Dr. Claire Dawson and her assistant, Ethan Ward, prepared for another long research day on a silent, untouched lake, far from any shelter or human activity. Claire had spent many years studying cold region ecosystems, traveling across harsh landscapes to understand how winter conditions shaped life beneath thick, ancient ice. She moved with calm precision, always organized, always careful. Her planning kept previous expeditions safe, and her steady approach made her a respected figure in her field. Ethan, younger and full of determination, had joined her to gain real field experience, eager to learn how demanding Arctic work differed from the controlled environment of laboratories. He respected her guidance and followed her steps closely, knowing the ice could shift without warning. Their small camp stood on a wide stretch of frozen water, where snow drifted across the glassy surface in thin, restless sheets. 2 sleds carried tools, insulated layers, fishing instruments, and a sealed container of bait prepared for sample testing. Claire and Ethan used hand drills to make openings into the lake, working slowly because every movement required balance on the cold, hollow ground. The thick morning fog hung heavily around them, covering the lake in a pale curtain that concealed the horizon. Even sound felt muted, as if the world had been wrapped in a layer of frozen cloth that absorbed every echo. Claire set the baited pile a short distance from their main drill holes, expecting it to help attract the organisms they hoped to measure during the upcoming readings. Ethan inspected one of the openings, brushing away the fine ice dust that gathered at the rim. Neither noticed the large polar bear moving steadily across the fog-covered plain. Its thick fur blended completely with the white surroundings, and the stillness of the morning concealed the sound of its paws pressing into the brittle lake surface. The scent of fish drifting from the bait guided the massive animal with direct and unwavering focus. Ethan shifted his boots and turned to lift another tool when the bear suddenly surged forward. Snow burst upward as the animal lunged from the fog, its weight sending a sharp crack racing across a thin stretch of ice beneath Ethan's footing. Before he could react, the frozen surface collapsed, dropping him into the freezing lake with a violent splash. The shock was immediate and brutal, seizing his body as cold water wrapped around him like iron. Claire spun around, heart pounding, just in time to see the huge predator lowering itself over the broken section of ice. The bear slammed a heavy paw toward Ethan, pushing him toward jagged ice edges that jutted through the opening like broken teeth. Ice shards scattered as the animal's immense weight crushed the fragile surface around them, widening the collapse and causing the edges to splinter further. Claire reached for her flare gun with stiff, trembling fingers and fired it into the fog, hoping the bright arc of heat would force the predator to retreat. Sparks scattered around the bear, glowing briefly against its pale coat before fading. The effect was the opposite of what she hoped. The bear grew more aggressive, lowering its head and swinging its powerful paws as it leaned closer to the trapped assistant. Ethan tried to free himself, but the freezing water tightened his limbs until they felt rigid and heavy. The bear bit into the thick fabric of his jacket, pulling him hard against the sharp ice. The impact crushed him against the frozen edge as more splinters broke away, some sliding across the lake toward the overturned sleds. The force of the bear's movement rocked the ground, sending equipment tumbling and scattering supplies across the uneven surface. The fog thickened again, swallowing the horizon, while the wide expanse of white seemed to grow even more empty around them. The only sounds were the bear's harsh breaths and the cracking of frozen layers in a scene that had shifted from calm to deadly in a matter of seconds. The predator eventually paused, lowering its head once more toward the broken ice. Claire stood frozen, her hands shaking from both fear and bitter cold. The heavy animal shifted its weight, sending a network of thin cracks outward like lightning beneath the surface. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, it lifted itself away from the shattered area. Its massive form moved back into the thick haze, fading as the fog reclaimed its outline. Soon, only faint, ghost-like movement remained in the mist. Claire rushed toward the fractured section, her boots sliding across splinters and uneven ridges. She leaned down and grabbed Ethan's jacket, but the stillness of his body confirmed the truth she had feared. The cold, the crushing force, and the deep wounds had taken him before help could reach their isolated lake. Breath shuddered from her chest as she pulled him clear of the water. She managed to move him onto a flatter patch beside the broken opening, though her own hands felt numb from frost and shock. Nearby, the overturned sleds lay scattered, their torn fabrics fluttering weakly in the wind. Cracked equipment and spilled bait covered the ice, and the attack site looked as though a violent storm had torn through it. Jagged lines, broken edges, and blood marked the once pristine surface. Claire forced her focus to remain sharp, gathering enough strength to secure emergency gear. She knew rescue teams were far away, and temperatures were quickly dropping as the pale light dimmed behind the fog. Time passed painfully slowly. She fired her remaining flare and activated a locator beacon, hoping the signal would reach distant monitoring teams. Snow gathered around her boots, covering some of the splintered ice and half-buried gear. She stayed beside Ethan, refusing to leave him alone, until she finally heard the faint sound of engines cutting through the frozen quiet. Rescuers reached her, guiding her towards safety while marking the devastated site for later investigation. By the next day, teams collected the damaged sleds, broken tools, and scattered bait to study the conditions surrounding the attack. Reports later confirmed that shifting ice, heavy fog, and the strong scent of fish had drawn the predator close. Officials emphasized that even highly trained researchers faced immense danger in such remote and unstable environments. Claire returned home with injuries, deep grief, and a renewed understanding of the unforgiving Arctic, carrying the memory of the lake and the harsh truth that nature's power could alter or end a life in only seconds. In November 2017, a small wildlife film team worked deep in the mountains of British Columbia, far from towns and far from any marked trails. Claire Thompson, the director, had spent many years creating nature films that focused on wild animals and the changing seasons. She loved calm places, long hikes, and quiet ridges, where she could study how the land shaped the lives of the creatures that lived there. Her work often took her far from safe areas, but she accepted the risks because she believed real stories came from real ground. She was known for patience and long hours spent watching distant herds through heavy lenses. Beside her was Ethan Brooks, the cinematographer. He had traveled through many remote regions and had learned how harsh mountain terrain could be. He carried strong equipment, heavy tripods, and waterproof gear because storms often arrived without warning. Ethan enjoyed the challenge of capturing small details, like frost melting on stones or caribou hooves breaking thin ice. He trusted his training and stayed calm even when conditions grew rough. Their crew had set up a simple base camp near a narrow canyon where groups of caribou passed during seasonal movement. The camp held tents, food boxes, camera cases, and protective covers for the machines. The area looked peaceful, but the early snow on higher slopes had pushed large animals toward lower ground. One of those animals was a massive grizzly, wandering through the forest in search of anything that smelled like food. The bear had lost access to usual feeding spots due to the sudden change in weather, forcing it into lower elevations where the crew now worked. On a clear morning, the team climbed a ridge above the canyon to adjust cameras and prepare for a long day of filming. The air felt sharp, and patches of old snow clung to shaded areas under tall pines. The crew spread out across the rocks, placing tripods at different angles. Bags filled with batteries and recording tools rested beside them. The scent of their supplies carried through the cold breeze, passing between trees and drifting into the dark timber below. Without warning, the forest shook as a heavy shape crashed through branches. The massive Grizzly stormed out from the thick cover with sudden force. Its weight sent stones rolling and snapped twigs under huge paws. The ridge that had felt calm only minutes earlier turned into a place of fear and confusion. Tripods toppled as the bear swept through them, and hard camera cases bounced across uneven ground. Bags split open, spilling items down the slopes. Ethan tried to create distance while the others stumbled back. The bear charged through the scattered equipment and struck him with overwhelming strength, hurling him into a rough boulder. The impact twisted his body, leaving him unable to rise as more gear tumbled around him. Claire fell behind a fallen trunk as the attack continued, the team breaking apart in panic while the ridge filled with movement and debris. The ridge felt trapped in chaos as the bear pushed through scattered objects, leaving deep marks in the ground and crushing cases beneath heavy weight. Claire stayed low behind the fallen trunk, her body shaking from cold fear and rough impact. She watched broken tools slide down the slope while the bear moved in wide circles, testing shapes and scents. The wind carried loose snow across the rocks, mixing with torn cloth and crushed plastic as the massive animal searched for anything that resembled food. The crew members who could still move crawled toward safer spots among the trees, trying to stay quiet while avoiding loose stones that could give away their positions. The air carried a thick stillness between sudden cracks made by shifting branches. Ethan remained near the boulder, motionless, his body twisted from the brutal strike. Claire felt a growing heaviness inside her chest as she realized he was no longer responding. The ridge now held a mix of broken gear and fallen bodies, creating a grim scene across the uneven ground. The bear eventually turned toward deeper forest, leaving smashed tripods, crushed bags, and torn covers scattered behind. Its heavy form disappeared between the trees, branches shaking as it moved away from the ridge and toward quieter ground. The silence that followed felt unbearable, broken only by faint wind sliding through the canyon. Claire pushed herself upright, her legs weak, her hands scraped from gripping the rough trunk. She moved toward the others, checking for signs of life among the scattered forms. 2 crew members remained alive but injured, lying among rocks with cuts and bruises from falling equipment. They gathered close, breath unsteady, trying to understand what had just taken place. The ridge that once held promise for beautiful scenes now sat covered in damaged items, sharp debris, and dark stains. Claire's mind struggled to balance grief with the urgent need to reach help before night covered the mountains again. Hours later, rescue teams reached the ridge after following faint signals from emergency beacons. They found Claire and the other survivors exhausted and trembling, surrounded by shattered remains of their film tools. The rescuers carried them down the slope while snow drifted over the broken ground, slowly covering the evidence of the attack. In the days that followed, the mountain crew faced heavy sorrow and physical recovery. The event left deep marks on their memories, reminding them how quickly quiet land could shift into deadly danger when powerful animals followed hunger into human paths.